The phone rang at exactly 3:17 a.m. on June 18, 1976. Sacramento County Dispatch had heard thousands of emergency calls, but the trembling whisper that came through the static that night would haunt them for decades. The caller could barely speak above a breath, terrified, violated, and forever changed by an encounter with someone who had just begun what would become the longest, most calculated reign of terror in American criminal history. What the dispatcher didn't know, what no one could have known, was that this single call would mark the beginning of a case that would span 4 decades, cross multiple states, claim at least 13 lives, and fundamentally change how we understand both criminal investigation and the very nature of evil itself. The man responsible would attack over 100 victims, evade capture by some of the most dedicated detectives in California, and walk freely among us for 40 years while maintaining a facade so convincing that even his own family never suspected the monster living under their roof. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a moment of madness or desperation. What unfolded over the next decade was methodical, evolving, and absolutely ruthless. The perpetrator didn't just commit crimes. He studied his victims for weeks, sometimes months, learning their routines, their relationships, their vulnerabilities. He would call them at home, whispering threats in the darkness. He knew when they came home from work, when their spouses traveled, when their children were asleep. He transformed the most basic human need, the feeling of safety in one's own home, into a weapon of psychological torture. The attacks began in Sacramento's quiet residential neighborhoods, places where people left their doors unlocked and children played in the streets until sunset. But this predator understood something that law enforcement of the 1970s was only beginning to grasp, that in an era before DNA evidence, before computer databases, before the communication networks that connect police departments today, a careful criminal could strike repeatedly and vanish like smoke. He exploited every weakness in the system, every gap in technology, every limitation of human investigation. By day, he lived an ordinary life. He had a job, relationships, responsibilities. Neighbors described him as quiet, unremarkable, perhaps even helpful. But when darkness fell, he became something else entirely. A phantom who could enter any home, overcome any defense, and disappear without leaving a trace that technology of the time could follow. He wasn't just committing crimes. He was conducting a masterclass in how to terrorize an entire state while remaining completely invisible. What makes this case extraordinary isn't just the scope of the crimes or the length of time he remained free. It's the evolution we witnessed, how a calculating predator transformed from a burglar to a rapist to a killer, each phase more violent than the last, each attack teaching him new lessons in domination and control. Law enforcement wasn't just chasing a criminal. They were tracking the real-time evolution of a predator who learned from every encounter, adapted to every investigation technique, and stayed consistently one step ahead of justice. For 40 years, families lived with unanswered questions. Survivors carried scars that never healed. Investigators dedicated their entire careers to a case that seemed unsolvable. Communities across California learned to lock their doors, check their windows, and wonder if the person standing behind them in line at the grocery store might be the monster they'd been reading about in the newspapers. The breakthrough, when it finally came, would revolutionize criminal investigation forever. It would prove that justice delayed doesn't always mean justice denied, and that some cases are never truly cold. They're just waiting for the right combination of technology, determination, and human ingenuity to crack them open. The capture of this predator would close one of the most important chapters in American criminal history and open an entirely new one in forensic science. But before we get to that moment of justice, we need to understand how it all began. We need to return to that terrified whisper in the darkness, to those quiet suburban streets where safety was an illusion, and to the beginning of a case that would prove that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly how to hide in plain sight. This is the story of how one man terrorized California for 40 years, and how advances in science, the dedication of investigators who never gave up, and the courage of survivors who refused to be silenced finally brought him to justice. This is the story of the Golden State Killer. California in the mid-1970s represented everything Americans believed about safety and prosperity. The suburbs of Sacramento stretched endlessly under blue skies, a landscape of ranch houses and swimming pools where families had moved to escape the chaos of urban life. These communities operated on trust. Front doors remained unlocked during dinner. Children walked to school alone. Neighbors knew each other's names and watched each other's homes during vacations. The local police departments were small, community-focused operations. Officers knew the teenagers who might cause trouble on Friday nights, and the elderly residents who called about suspicious noises that usually turn out to be raccoons. Crime existed, certainly, but it followed predictable patterns: domestic disputes, bar fights, the occasional burglary when homeowners left for weekend trips. What was about to unfold challenged every assumption these communities held about safety, privacy, and the nature of criminal behavior. Detective William Hayes had worked Sacramento County for 12 years when the first reports started coming in. Burglaries, initially. Homes entered during the night while families slept. Nothing major taken, just personal items rearranged, food eaten from refrigerators, small valuables missing. The break-ins seemed random, scattered across different neighborhoods with no apparent connection. But Hayes noticed something others missed. The intruder possessed an almost supernatural knowledge of each home's layout and the schedules of its occupants. The call started 3 weeks after the burglaries began. Families would answer their phones to hear heavy breathing, then whispered threats delivered in a voice that seemed to know intimate details about their daily lives. The caller knew when the husband left for work, when the children attended school, when the family dog was let outside. He described the layout of bedrooms, the contents of medicine cabinets, the hiding places where people kept their valuables. "I'm going to kill your husband and take you," the voice would whisper before hanging up. The calls came at all hours, during dinner, late at night, early morning. Families began to dread the sound of their own telephone. Some disconnected their phones entirely, cutting themselves off from friends and relatives rather than risk hearing that voice again. Detective Hayes connected the phone calls to the burglaries when the Hendersons reported both incidents within a week. Someone had entered their Rancho Cordova home, eaten food from their kitchen, and left behind evidence of having been in their teenage daughter's bedroom. 2 days later, Mrs. Henderson received a call describing exactly where he had been in the house and what he planned to do when he returned. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Families installed multiple locks, security systems, and exterior lighting. Hardware stores reported unprecedented sales of deadbolts and window alarms. But the attacks continued, and with each incident, the perpetrator demonstrated an ability to overcome any security measure. He could disable alarm systems, pick sophisticated locks, and enter homes through openings that seemed impossibly small. On June 18, 1976, the nature of the crimes changed forever. The Davis family had taken every precaution: new locks, motion sensors, a security system that connected directly to the sheriff's department. But shortly after 3 a.m., 23-year-old Jennifer Davis woke to find a masked figure standing beside her bed. Her husband Michael was in the living room, bound and gagged, helpless to protect his wife from what followed. The assault lasted 3 hours. The perpetrator had studied the house for weeks, knew exactly how to approach without triggering the security system, and had planned every detail of the attack. He spoke in whispers throughout, describing what he would do to family members if his victims made any sound. His knowledge of the family's routines, relationships, and personal details was comprehensive and terrifying. When Jennifer Davis made that 3:17 a.m. call to emergency dispatch, her whispered plea for help marked a turning point in California criminal history. This wasn't a burglary that escalated. It was a carefully planned assault by someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. The level of preparation, the psychological manipulation, and the calculated nature of the violence indicated law enforcement was dealing with an entirely different category of criminal. Detective Hayes arrived at the scene to find a crime that challenged everything he understood about criminal behavior. The perpetrator had brought his own restraints, had knowledge of the home's electrical system, and had spent hours inside without leaving fingerprints or other trace evidence. Most disturbing was the psychological component. The victim described being terrorized by someone who seemed to know everything about her family's life. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Department formed a task force within a week of the Davis attack. Detective Hayes was joined by investigators from neighboring jurisdictions as reports of similar attacks began flooding in from across Northern California. The perpetrator wasn't limiting himself to one area. He was striking in different counties, different cities, always following the same methodical pattern of surveillance, psychological intimidation, and carefully planned assault. The victims' descriptions were remarkably consistent despite the trauma they had endured. The attacker was a white male, average height and build, who spoke in whispers and seemed to know advanced techniques for restraining and controlling multiple people simultaneously. He carried a flashlight but never used overhead lighting. He wore a ski mask and gloves, leaving no physical evidence behind. What made the investigation particularly challenging was the perpetrator's apparent law enforcement or military training. He understood surveillance techniques, crime scene contamination, and police procedures. He knew how long it typically took for emergency response in different areas and planned his attacks accordingly. Some investigators began to suspect they were dealing with someone who had professional knowledge of criminal investigation. By the end of 1976, the task force had documented 12 similar attacks across 5 counties. The perpetrator was escalating in both frequency and violence. Each assault demonstrated increasing confidence and sophistication. He was learning from each encounter, adapting his techniques, and becoming more difficult to track. The investigation that began with Detective Hayes studying burglary reports had evolved into the largest manhunt in California history. The media began referring to him as the East Area Rapist, a name that would stick for decades. But investigators knew they were dealing with something far more complex than a geographical designation could capture. This was a predator who was evolving, learning, and preparing for something even more devastating. The phone calls continued, the attacks increased, and communities across California began to understand that their fundamental assumptions about safety and security were about to be shattered completely. By 1978, the East Area Rapist had committed over 40 documented attacks across Northern California. But something was changing. The frequency of attacks in Sacramento began to decline, while reports of similar crimes started appearing hundreds of miles to the south. Investigators initially dismissed these Southern California incidents as copycat crimes. The methods were similar, but the geographic distance seemed impossible for one perpetrator to cover. Detective Maria Santos of the Orange County Sheriff's Department received a call in October 1979 that would fundamentally change her understanding of the case. Dr. Robert Carlson, a prominent cardiologist, and his girlfriend Deborah Martinez had been found dead in their Goleta condominium. The crime scene bore unmistakable similarities to the East Area Rapist attacks, but with one horrifying difference. Both victims had been murdered. The killer had bound both victims using the same elaborate ligature methods documented in Northern California. He had moved through the residence with identical precision, taking specific personal items while leaving valuable electronics untouched. But this time, instead of fleeing after the assault, he had executed both victims with clinical efficiency before disappearing into the night. Detective Santos contacted the Sacramento task force immediately. When she described the crime scene details over the phone, Detective Hayes felt a chill of recognition. The knot patterns, the choice of restraints, the items taken from the scene, everything matched their perpetrator's signature methods. But the implications were staggering. If this was the same person, he had evolved from a serial rapist into a serial killer, and his operational territory now covered the entire state of California. A joint task force was assembled within weeks of the Goleta murders. Investigators from Sacramento, Contra Costa, Santa Barbara, Orange, and Los Angeles counties began sharing information in unprecedented detail. What emerged was a pattern of violence that stretched across 5 years and encompassed crimes that were far more connected than anyone had previously realized. The Southern California attacks followed the same methodical preparation as the earlier assaults. Victims reported receiving threatening phone calls weeks before the attacks. Neighbors noticed suspicious activity, someone watching houses, testing locks, studying family routines. But the violence had escalated dramatically. The perpetrator was no longer content with assault and psychological torture. He had discovered that murder eliminated witnesses entirely. Keith and Patricia Morrison became the second confirmed murder victims in December 1979. The young couple had been celebrating their engagement when the killer entered their Irvine home. The crime scene revealed the same obsessive planning, but also showed signs of increasing confidence and brutality. The perpetrator had spent hours in the house, methodically searching through personal belongings before killing both victims. By early 1980, the task force had connected 6 murders to their suspect. Each crime demonstrated increasing sophistication and decreasing concern for risk. The killer was operating across a territory that spanned 400 miles, striking in different jurisdictions with methods that seemed to improve with each attack. He had evolved from a burglar to a rapist to a killer who could disappear completely after committing the most serious crimes imaginable. The scale of the investigation required resources that no single police department possessed. The California Department of Justice became involved, providing laboratory services and coordination between agencies. For the first time, investigators were using computer databases to track patterns across multiple jurisdictions, though the technology was primitive compared to modern standards. Detective Hayes, now leading the Northern California investigation, worked 18-hour days, trying to anticipate where the killer might strike next. The perpetrator's knowledge of police procedures had become even more sophisticated. He seemed to understand how long it took different agencies to share information, and he exploited those delays by moving between jurisdictions immediately after each attack. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts described a perpetrator who was likely employed in a position requiring travel throughout California. He possessed advanced knowledge of law enforcement techniques, possibly gained through military or police training. Most concerning was the assessment that his confidence was growing with each successful attack, suggesting the violence would continue to escalate. Public fear reached unprecedented levels throughout California. Gun sales increased dramatically. Home security companies reported month-long waiting lists, and many families relocated to other states entirely. The killer wasn't just committing individual crimes. He was terrorizing an entire population and forcing fundamental changes in how people live their daily lives. After Janelle Martinez was murdered in Irvine in May 1986, the attacks stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Months passed without new incidents. The task force continued investigating, but without fresh evidence or new attacks to analyze, the case began to lose momentum. Other crimes demanded attention. Resources were redirected, and the East Area Rapist investigation was gradually relegated to cold case status. Detective Hayes retired in 1992 without solving the case that had defined his career. Detective Santos continued working the Southern California murders until her retirement in 1995. Both investigators maintained personal files on the case, refusing to accept that such a methodical killer could simply vanish. They stayed in contact with victims' families and continued following up on tips and new leads, even without official support. The case entered a period that seemed like permanent dormancy. Occasional newspaper articles marked anniversaries of major attacks, but public attention had moved on to more recent crimes. The victims and their families felt forgotten, abandoned by a system that seemed to lose interest when headlines faded. But some investigators refused to let the case die completely. In 2001, criminalist Paul Rogers was reviewing cold cases for possible DNA analysis when he encountered the East Area Rapist files. Advances in genetic science had made it possible to extract DNA profiles from evidence that was previously unusable. Rogers submitted biological evidence from multiple crime scenes for analysis, hoping that time and technology might finally provide the breakthrough investigators needed. The results were extraordinary. DNA evidence from Northern California crime scenes matched DNA from the Southern California murders. For the first time, investigators had definitive proof that all these crimes were committed by the same person. The East Area Rapist and the Southern California Killer were the same individual, a single perpetrator responsible for over 50 rapes and at least 13 murders. The DNA breakthrough reinvigorated the investigation. A new task force was formed, combining the resources and knowledge of all previous investigations. Detective James Mitchell, who had studied the case extensively, was assigned to lead the renewed effort. The challenge now was using 21st century science to catch a 20th century killer who might not even be alive. The investigation had entered a new phase. DNA evidence provided the certainty that had eluded investigators for decades, but it also revealed the true scope of the crimes. California had been terrorized by a single individual whose methodical violence spanned a decade and covered the entire state. The question now was whether advances in forensic science could finally identify someone who had remained anonymous for over 25 years. By 2016, the investigation had reached another apparent dead end. Despite having a complete DNA profile, law enforcement databases contained no matches. The perpetrator had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection, or he had committed his crimes before such databases existed. Detective Mitchell faced the same frustration that had plagued investigators for 4 decades, having evidence but no way to connect it to a specific individual. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Genetic genealogist Barbara Stevens had been developing techniques for using public genealogy websites to identify suspects in cold cases. Her method involved uploading crime scene DNA profiles to consumer genealogy databases and building family trees to identify potential suspects. The technique had solved several cold cases, but nothing as complex as the Golden State Killer investigation. In 2017, Detective Mitchell contacted Stevens about applying her techniques to the Golden State Killer case. The DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database, under a pseudonym. Within hours, the system identified several distant genetic relatives, people who shared common ancestors with the unknown perpetrator several generations back. Stevens began the painstaking process of building family trees for each genetic match. She traced bloodlines back to common ancestors in the 1800s, then forward through all their descendants. The work required months of research through birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, and census data. Gradually, she narrowed the field to a handful of men who could potentially be the Golden State Killer. One name emerged as the most likely candidate: Joseph Franklin, a former police officer who had lived in both Northern and Southern California during the relevant time periods. Franklin had worked for the Auburn Police Department during the early East Area Rapist attacks, then moved to Southern California in the late 1970s, coinciding with the shift in the killer's geographic focus. The circumstantial evidence was compelling. Franklin had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting, a termination that occurred shortly before the attacks began escalating in violence. His police training would explain the sophisticated techniques used in the crimes. His knowledge of different California jurisdictions matched the killer's ability to evade capture across multiple counties. Detective Mitchell obtained surveillance authorization and began monitoring Franklin's current residence in Citrus Heights, a Sacramento suburb. The 72-year-old retiree lived quietly with his adult daughter and granddaughter, maintaining a garden and taking daily walks around the neighborhood. To observers, he appeared to be an ordinary elderly man living out his retirement in suburban anonymity. The challenge was obtaining a DNA sample from Franklin without alerting him to the investigation. Undercover officers began collecting items he discarded: coffee cups from restaurants, tissues from his car, anything that might contain his DNA. The samples were analyzed and compared to the crime scene evidence. On April 20th, 2018, laboratory results confirmed what investigators had suspected for months. Joseph Franklin's DNA was a perfect match to evidence collected from multiple Golden State Killer crime scenes. After more than 4 decades, law enforcement finally knew the identity of California's most elusive serial killer. The arrest warrant was prepared with extraordinary secrecy. Only a handful of investigators knew Franklin's identity, and the operation was planned to minimize any possibility of the suspect fleeing or destroying evidence. After 42 years of investigation, law enforcement was not going to risk losing their target at the final moment. At 6:15 a.m. on April 24, 2018, Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies surrounded Franklin's home in Citrus Heights. The arrest was swift and without incident. Franklin, awakened from sleep, offered no resistance as he was taken into custody. Neighbors watched in shock as the elderly man they had known for years was led away in handcuffs. The search of Franklin's residence revealed a cache of evidence that connected him to the crimes spanning 4 decades. Investigators found jewelry taken from victims, photographs of attack locations, and detailed maps of neighborhoods where crimes had occurred. Hidden in his garage were restraints and tools that matched those used in the original attacks. Within hours of the arrest, news of the capture spread worldwide. The Golden State Killer case had attracted international attention during the decades of investigation, and the resolution was front-page news across the globe. Survivors and victims' families received phone calls from investigators, finally learning that the person who had terrorized them had been identified and arrested. Detective Mitchell held a press conference that afternoon, surrounded by investigators who had worked the case across multiple decades. Some were current officers, others had come out of retirement for this moment. The announcement that the Golden State Killer had been captured represented not just the solving of a case, but validation for everyone who had refused to give up hope that justice would eventually prevail. Joseph Franklin was charged with 26 counts including murder, rape, and kidnapping. At age 72, he faced the possibility of the death penalty for crimes committed when DNA evidence didn't exist and computer databases were science fiction. The case that had begun with a whispered phone call in 1976 had finally reached its conclusion through advances in forensic science that the original investigators could never have imagined. The arrest of Joseph Franklin marked the end of the longest serial killer investigation in American history. But for the survivors and families who had waited decades for answers, it represented something more profound. Proof that some cases are never truly cold, and that the combination of dedicated investigators, advancing science, and a refusal to give up hope can ultimately overcome even the most carefully planned crimes. Love a good mystery? Hit that subscribe button and let's explore more unsolved stories together.